Hello, today's Bible study comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, and it reads as follows. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness and insults, or in hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Well, you see here when it starts off, Paul in verse 8 says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Paul is praying, and Paul was doing what he had told us to do. I'm in trouble, I'm in affliction. Who do I call on? The Lord. But pray. It may not happen right away, and it tells us not to be anxious, but pray, he said, and give thanks. And that's what he did. He said, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. And Paul was a prayer. And he prayed about this thorn in his flesh. See, he wanted the Lord to hear his prayer, and he knew that he needed to be delivered. He was weak. He couldn't do it alone. So who did he go to? He went to the Lord. And if you notice here, Paul prayed about the same thing 3 times. Okay? And it's not wrong to pray about the same thing. Just know when you pray that you are genuinely praying to the Lord and leave it with the Lord. You know, even Paul did it here when he was praying, because it says he pleaded with the Lord 3 times. But he is not the only one. He did it to Jesus. And then if you look back, um, remember when Jesus went and prayed 3 times. So pray, but give it to the Lord. And there was nothing wrong with what Paul was doing. Okay, so he pleaded with the Lord, and this was Paul just talking to the Lord, and I'm sure he was saying, Lord, please, this that is in my flesh, if it be your will, and all these things. And the prayer wasn't answered the first and the second time. And he was praying for it to leave him. That's what he wanted to do. He says that it might depart from me. Um, Paul didn't want this suffering. He didn't want this thorn in his flesh, and this was brought to him. Um, so Paul didn't want this suffering. But guess where he went when he was suffering? To the Lord. And he was doing it, and I'm sure he was very, you know, engaged in saying, Father, take this off of me. Please deliver me from this. I'm sure his passion was heavy in this situation. Um, and remember, it was a physical thing to him. It had to be bothering him in every level of his being. Okay? And what was it? He said concerning this thing? Um, and we don't know what it was. We just know that Paul was constantly in danger. He had to be warned, and this suffering was always about him. Doesn't tell us exactly what it was. And then he says in verse 9, and he said to me, so God answers Paul. Uh-oh, here we go. My grace is sufficient for you, For my strength is made perfect in your weakness. Uh-oh. Now this is very important because my grace is sufficient for you. And okay, so I know you want this removed from you, Paul. He says, but my grace is sufficient for that thorn that you have in you. So everything you need is in the grace that I've given you. Excuse me. So everything you need, okay? My grace is sufficient. And the Lord told him, and Paul had to believe that it was sufficient enough. And during this thorn in his flesh, God was strengthening Paul because he says right there, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul was in weakness. This thorn was all over him, okay? But my grace is sufficient. And then my strength is made perfect in weakness. And this grace is sufficient. He says, I'm gonna meet every need with the grace. And this grace I have, it doesn't end. It's a never-ending supply, and it doesn't go anywhere. And what is this grace? What is this grace? It's strength. It is true strength. It is God's strength that Paul works and talks about here. And this is what the Lord has said to him. And that's why my grace is sufficient for you. But then Paul understands now. Okay, and he was told by the Lord, therefore most gladly I will rather boast on my weakness, because his weakness is going to show you God's strength, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Uh-oh. Now you're understanding that, hey, I could boast about my weakness now because it shows the power of Christ. It highlights, it points to Christ's power resting upon me. And in my weakness, I have to depend on God. I have to depend on his grace. I have to depend on everything coming from him because I'm not doing it on my own. And this was done for Paul. And it made Paul turn to God even more. And God made him stronger. God made him stronger through this suffering. See, if Paul would have been conceited, arrogant, and prideful and put it all on him, he probably wouldn't even called on the Lord. Or if he brought it to his attention, he wouldn't have been able to show off. And I say show off here, or boast on the power of God, because see, it was Paul's weakness that needed to be there so God's strength could truly show. So Paul says, therefore I take pleasure in these infirmities, in my weakness. And Paul says, hey, keep it coming. Keith Sweat used to sing a song, Keep It Coming, but he says, keep it coming. Because he is happy that the Father is there. And he is happy that the Father has told him to rely on God's grace and the strength of God. So he said, when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when I am weak, I rely totally on the Lord. I am totally dependent on God. And that is what he wants us to be anyway. So Paul realizes the strength that comes with the total dependence on the Lord. And then he says, I take pleasure in infirmities. And Paul says, hey, it is what it is. I'm fine with it. I take pleasure in it. But what he's saying is, I don't seek to be sick. I don't want to go through these things. I don't seek it out, okay? But I am justified before God by my suffering. And we have to understand, if Jesus suffered, we gonna suffer. We have to get that. And we are justified before God by our suffering. And Paul was not out there in the flesh trying to find these things. This thorn was brought to him. We just read it. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Victory, victory, victory. So this world can't do nothing to him, is what he's saying. And he goes on and continues. And Paul is making sure that we understand we should rely on God. We should be totally dependent on God, that his life always pointed to Jesus. His actions always pointed to Jesus. But in all that he did, even with this thorn in his flesh, his message, his concentration was to show you God. Amen.